Hi everyone. I'm here at the gym in Toronto where I work out, and we're gonna do a live today where I'll be joined by my strength coach, whose name is Lovedeep Dhunna, and he'll be with me in just a second. So hang tight. I'm gonna just stick our course link down here for anyone who's interested in checking that out. Hey guys. Hey there. Hi Kim. Thanks for joining in, guys. So Lovedeep will be with me in just a moment, and yes, his name is all one word, Lovedeep. And I've been working with him for I think around like 4 years, maybe 3 years, maybe I think it's 4. And we just finished a squat session together where I've been kind of training myself for a little while, and just did like a check-in with him today to see how the squat is going, and it's going well. So we did some squat work, we did some therapeutic stuff for my sacrum because it was doing weird things, and then we did some other stuff like hamstring curls and split squats. And he's coming in. Come sit next to me.
Show me?
Yeah.
Hi.
Here he is. Okay. So this is Lovedeep Dhunna. Those of you who listen to Catherine's podcast, Mindful Strength, her episode that just dropped this week is interviewing this guy. So when you hear his voice, this is the face you can picture saying all those words. And last night I sent an email out to everyone on our main list where I was talking a little bit about how I come to know the things that I know and the things that I teach, and I've had a whole lot of coaches influence me over the years, but I think that Lovedeep has to be one of the most, if not the most influential guy who has been with me on this journey from kind of being this hyperflexy yoga person to someone who now lives in a pretty capable body, who is just squatting, how much did I squat, 110?
110.
110 today, which for me is a lot.
Full depth, too.
Full depth. So the reason why I wanted to talk to Lovedeep with you guys today is because I want to bring up a certain topic that tends to get a little bit of a controversy growing in the community around glute softening. And so we're going to talk about glute work and why it's important to engage the glutes and strengthen the glutes. But I want to then also relate that to a very specific area of the body, the piriformis and the sciatic nerve, and talk about the link between glute strengthening and sciatica in general. Because I think, what would you say is a common way that people tend to address sciatica?
Probably the worst way.
Yeah.
Right, which is taking the lacrosse ball or any sort of myofascial direct work on the piriformis.
Yeah.
It's going to give you temporary relief, and I'll tell you why, right? It's simply in the fact that any myofascial work you do that's self-myofascial induced is going to increase proprioception of the joint. So it's going to temporarily change how you align yourself from anywhere from 1 to 6 hours.
And we're talking about like that thing that people do where you take a ball and you sit where the ball is kind of stuck into the side of your butt.
Yeah, exactly.
Where it's going to wedge itself into like the deep lateral rotators, which is what the piriformis is part of that group. And the piriformis and the sciatic nerve are buddy-buddy.
Well, and that's it. You're going to have the sciatic nerve going, underneath the piriformis, and it's a very small space. So the thing is, it's unfortunate that we often blame the piriformis, where like I'd say, in my experience, 90% of the time it's not the piriformis, but we blame it unfortunately because of all the other influencing factors. Now that can be a whole day of talking about what those factors are.
Yeah, we don't have to get into that right now. But I think, for relevance in terms of what we see in yoga, we know that people are addicted to Pigeon Pose. And so with that in mind, what is happening in a stretch like Pigeon where we see people just kind of hanging out in those tissues?
Yeah. So if we just look at it from the standpoint of, say...
Sorry?
Well, let's just talk muscle, right? And the reality is, when we think about what we do with Pigeon Pose, right, we're putting the IT band under disproportionate tension, right, while going to some sort of degree of a forward fold, right? So what we're doing is we're basically putting the SI joint into a pretty vulnerable and open position, right? It's essentially wedged, right? And that can go into what we refer to as a sacral torsion, right?
What's another word for torsion if people haven't heard that before?
It's going to be a twist and inflection or a twist and extension.
Right.
Right? And the things we start getting those and it's disproportionate, we're going to take whatever's living in those structures, right? And we're going to cause either some sort of, restriction, right? Or some sort of hypermobility. Right. Which ends up resulting in some sort of symptomology.
And what I see, if we just stick on this pigeon pose thread a little bit, is far more emphasis on stretching those tissues and getting them to almost become like eccentrically locked.
Yep.
Rather than being able to contract those tissues in more of their concentric range, using muscles like the glutes to perform hip extension movements, because we're so used to softening the glutes and back bends and instead relying on the lower back to do the hinging for us into the back bend instead.
Yeah. So low distributions are everything. Okay.
Did you hear that? Low distribution is everything.
So if we don't have a proportional low distribution, in the context of say the piriformis and the sciatic nerve, right? We think about the glutes and softening the glutes, right? And when we look at glutes, we're looking at those, the multitude of fibers, deep and superficial. There's so much potential there that's going to just think about muscular structure from the standpoint of its influence on the joint. That if we don't have muscular contraction and control, we're not talking aggressive contraction, right? What is controlling the infrastructure of that joint? Yeah. Right? And if it's not the glute, it's going to be something else. If it's something else, it's a compensation. If we get a compensation, we're going to have a imbalanced distribution of the load, and because the sciatic nerve is such a sensitive area, right, we're talking anywhere from L3 down to S3, there's just too much potential for injury or discomfort happening.
For sure. So Kimberly has a good question here. What is actually happening in the body when that temporary relief comes with the ball? And how can we explain that to students in simple terms to do something different other than that?
So really good question. So if you think about what proprioception is, right? Proprioception is going to give you a sense of where the joint is relative to its surrounding environment. So we take a ball, we put it up into the upper quadrant of the SI joint, okay, and we start working on the sciatic.
So we're talking about putting the ball right in here.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay.
For example.
So we're with the piriformis and the sciatic nerve, they're running right along this area of your butt. Okay. So when you stick a ball in there.
So now we start getting this increased proprioception. So what's happening is you're doing two things, right? Your body's all of a sudden aware of that, acutely aware of that joint. So all of a sudden you're going to change your alignment temporarily, right? And then that will be favorably because we're going to change the entire kinetic chain. Okay, the entire kinetic chain in this context, we're talking about the arch of the foot, all the way up the sacrosupplex, sacrospinous ligaments, up to the lumbar erectors. The chain will change. Okay, that's going to last you anywhere from 1 to 6 hours. That's how long it takes for the nervous system to recognize a change. It's going to give you temporary relief, but because we haven't actually changed the load distribution, we haven't changed the infrastructure of how the actual nerve is being exposed to the surrounding tissues, it's going to revert back. We haven't educated the body to stay that way because the affected structures have not been mechanically changed or biochemically changed.
So I think that, in my experience, when I'm trying to get my students and clients to understand why using the ball or even using a foam roller, like it feels temporarily good in that moment, and that's not a bad thing. Like if someone comes to us and they're having a shit day and we want them to feel a little bit better, then using these techniques just to get them a little bit of good feeling in their body is not bad. But if they're coming to us with the intention of long-term change, if they're coming to your classes and saying like, well, I'm showing up here because I want to feel like I'm getting more mobility, the mobility is going to be very temporary from any work that you do with the ball. In order for that mobility to stick and to actually cause tissue adaptation, that's where actual load and stress on the tissue is going to need to happen for there to be an actual shift in the way things move and the way things are able to stabilize the joint. Yeah.
If you think about, for anyone who's a manual therapist, we use something like active release technique. It's only going to work successfully if you're able to integrate that into the person's nervous system. So the shortcoming of these manual therapy modalities is you don't educate the nervous system. I do the work for you. I release the joint, which is the equivalent of the lacrosse ball, right? It's going to give someone temporary relief, but the nervous system hasn't understood the change, right? It hasn't changed the structures based on, just education. It's going to go back to what it knows. When we talk about, I've talked to you about engrams, right? Motor engrams. If you never learn a skill, it's going to take 300 to 500 reps for you to actually integrate that skill to your nervous system. If you have a jacked up piriformis, it's going to take about 5,000 new repetitions of a high quality movement to override that old pattern.
I remember I asked you that, and that's exactly what it is, Maggie, what you just said about the relief of symptoms versus treating the actual root of the issue. When I first started training with Lovedeep, one of my goals was to be able to get a chin up, which I just had never been able to do in any of the training I had done prior to working with him. And I had all these other shitty patterns ingrained in my body. And so he explained to me how if I had just walked in here off the street having never tried to do a chin up before, I would have been just like crushing it way sooner. But because I was already at it like this, would you call it like a deficit, or like the grooves were so deep in another direction that like it took me that much longer to come back to a suitable baseline to then actually make some progress and build things up in a way that was productive. Okay, so can we now talk about what is happening when we build tone in the glute muscles themselves, and how that can help to potentially alleviate sciatic symptoms?
Sure. Okay. So we'll work with the same idea of the load distribution piece, right? It's talking strictly from a muscular standpoint. If we think about the glutes, we're going to talk specifically about those deeper fibers. So these are the ones that don't insert into the IT band.
Okay.
So if you think about that just in the context of application, no insertion into the IT band, we don't need pigeon pose. Right? We don't need to adjust anything. We're not going to fix anything because we're not putting tension on the IT band. Right? So if we're thinking about those lower fibers, they cross the SI joint. Right? They go from the ilium to the sacrum. So that's going to ensure we actually get proper opening and closing of the SI joint. Right? So there's our first piece of load distribution that needs to happen. Now, if we get the SI joint moving, we think about everything that lives inside the pelvis, the obturator, the gemelli, right, various fascial lines, the pelvic floor. Those fibers are going to innervate just by the nature of the pelvic floor, the SI joint moving in its proper rhythm. If you got a proper rhythm happening there, right, now the nerves are actually going to start settling in the correct area. Right, unimpeded, unrestricted, unless there's an inflammatory process happening locally on the tissue. Okay? So we want to get proper glute firing, proper glute tone.
Hey Carmen, hey Asia.
To start happening in order to actually encourage those intrinsic structures to start working. Now what we've done is we've simply developed a reflexive loop, right, which is intrinsic in nature. Right, back up to the spinal erectors, into the multifidus, into the TVA, back to the pelvic floor, and back down to the glutes.
We're talking about glutes and sciatica stuff. Okay, just for those of you joining in at this moment. So in a super simplistic way, how I've sometimes envisioned this is for those who have been told, they've either been told to soften their glutes, or they just, have spent 20 years sitting on their ass and their glutes have essentially just not been functioning the way we want them to function. There's sort of like a symptom of like, I call it a saggy balloon. So there's this lack of tone, this flat ass syndrome of saggy balloon, where that can cause, would you say it's like a compression effect, or is it just like there's just a lack of basic innervation? Like I see it as sort of like...
It's both.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. The best thing is look at old carpet.
Old carpet.
That's essentially what's happening. If you look at like Berber carpet, right, it's all matted down, right? That's essentially what's happening with the soft tissue associated, right? So you're getting a lot of adhesions, a lot of restrictions, a lot of disproportionate alignment happening as a result of your body's adapted to give you some stability. Is it optimal? No, far from it. Right?
So picture this in your mind for a second. You've either been softening your glutes, not using them, and you've been sitting on your ass for many years, and then you go to yoga, better yet, a yin class maybe, and sit in pigeon pose for 5 minutes on each side. What is that going to do to potentially exacerbate those already crappy feelings that someone might be having? That's literally a pain in the ass. And I see this a lot of people come to yoga who have sciatica, and they're told to stretch. They're told to stretch out that area. And I think, again, temporarily, that might feel good.
It does, because it does change. Like, here's the old school thought process I can offer. So a lot of podiatrists back in the day, they were getting really, really amazing results in women with foot pain. What did they do? Every time they came to visit, they would say just wear a different kind of heel. Right? So every week, they would change the height of the heel. Why? It's novel to your nervous system. Until it's no longer novel, it's going to cause a change in how you respond to something. You never actually change the issue. So I stretch the piriformis. I take a ball to it the next time, right? I take a band to it next time. I do some distraction to it next time. I do fascial stretch the next time, right? It's going to keep giving you relief in that moment because it's novel to the nervous system. Does it address the issue? Absolutely not, because we're talking one tiny muscle amongst a very, very significant structure of the entire pelvis.
For sure. If you're just tuning in, this is Lovedeep Dhunna. He's my strength coach. He's on Catherine's Mindful Strength podcast. It just dropped this week. And in that podcast, I just listened to it, you also talk about tissue deformation. I think that that's a term or phrase that we don't like to think about because no one's going to yoga to deform their tissues. But really, when you say you're there to get more flexible, that's essentially what you're doing. And that's what these positions, when they're repeated on such a regular basis and held for long periods of time, is actually going to do to the tissue. And people are often completely unaware that that's the effect that the practice can have. Is there a question there? Yeah, sends the same information to the already sleepy muscles. Exactly.
Exactly. So we are what we repeatedly do. And the thing is, we talk tissue deformation. I use that terminology much more than I'll use stretching, because tissue deformation is a very, very different process. We can put ourselves into an active stretch, and I use a lot of active stretching with my clients. And what we're actually encouraging active contraction release, right? Reciprocal inhibition. So I'm increasing length tension in, say, the pec minor for someone who's very kyphotic. I am stretching that muscle, even though it's an atrophy weak muscle. The act of me contracting and actually looking for a deformation, not stretching it, but just encouraging a sense of lengthening, right? We'll actually encourage biochemical changes, biomechanical shifts, much more than if I just passively go into a pec minor stretch against the wall.
So, I mean, Maggie's bringing up a really good point here where she says most of us are chasing sensation instead of creating new sensations, but really new information for the body. So, I mean, this probably, I don't know, maybe it's not as much of an issue when you're working with people in a gym where they're coming here to like get stronger, but what do you say to people when they're just like, I don't know if I feel it? Like they're just always going to feel something and chase that sensation.
It depends on the personality. So, I talk a lot about communication modalities, and understanding how a person learns and actually feels. Ultimately, we're all kinesthetic. So if I need them to get to feel something, I got to get them really, really hyper aware of the subtle things that are happening, or get them really, really attuned to what the intent is. So they're saying, my sciatic pain is still there. We only done one stretch. It's like, let's just keep working through the process here, right? And we'll get the change, right? Now the thing is, when we start looking at these, we'll call them just the quick fixes, right? There's an opportunity in those to get that immediate change, right? So we can use that to alleviate some of the symptomology to get the more, structured work to happen, right? But if they don't feel it, right, usually people are pretty checked out. If they have that very atrophy muscle, you gotta tell them it's an atrophy, it's weak, it's not aware. It's gonna take a couple exposures to actually get there. And, in your experience, you can even talk about this. By the time you get to a third, fourth, fifth set of something, you feel it. It just takes a repetition.
And I mean, and at the same time, I think that when we come in, like I know when I first came in and started working with you, there was areas of my body that I was so disconnected to that I wasn't going to feel it because it wasn't like on my cortical map. Like my brain was completely disconnected from that part of me. I'm specifically talking about the back of my shoulders and like the trap 3 or lower traps where I just had such a hard time even feeling anything happening back there. So he would tell me, like he could see the muscle actually turning on, but in my mind I was like, I don't feel anything. Did I miss a question here? Do you think it's counterproductive to try to learn yoga while healing from atrophy from knee surgery?
Good question. So if I give you my complete biased answer, right, I would say yes, right? And I only say that because the thing is, unless you're going to be really, really informed in your yoga practice and actually use it as an inducer of parasympathetic activity, right, which is usually not the intent of a yoga class, right? They say it's kind of a secondary thing. You're not going to accomplish the structural development you need through all the kind of changes that are involved in the knee. Now, if you can use it as something that's going to help you down-regulate and relax and rest, it will speed up the healing process for sure.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is like, what's the intention behind learning the yoga? So it's like, if you're turning to yoga to rehab the knee, no.
Like I my own experience is like I used yoga quite extensively to rehab my back. Right, I had entirely arthritic lumbar spine, but I was very aware on what I should do, should not do. So I actually use it more as it's what I would probably call like an intrinsic strengthening intrinsic strengthening modality, right? And I was lifting 4, 5, 6 days a week.
Which is the key part of it.
Sprinting twice a week and doing yoga 3 times a week, right? It was just covering the stuff I did not want to do in the gym as far as getting my intrinsic structures and inner unit fired up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like that multidisciplinary approach is really what's essential. What are good repetition exercises or actually poses that provide long-term relief and health for the sciatic area?
So it's a big question, right? It's a really big question because sciatic is not going to be, just one avenue. So the thing is, we have to identify what's going on with the sciatic nerve. We just talk about just generalities, like I said, from anywhere from L3 or L4, depending on the person, down to S3, right? We got that sciatic nerve, traveling through and being pinched up. That's just our stabilization pattern. We got the force patterns as well from the ground up. So we're talking the arch of the foot, the back of the lower leg, bicep femoris, sacrotuberous, sacrospinous ligament, all the way to lumbar erectors. All those structures have to be addressed.
So we're talking about like the posterior chain. Again, if you think about yoga and all the forward bending, all that stuff is getting the same information over and over and over again. That's leading it more towards like an eccentric state, chronically lengthened, can't contract, and the tone there will diminish after a while.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's like we're looking at exercises that could be hamstring curls, glute.
Basically, lay out what we have to work with when we talk posterior chain, and think about to what level of regression or descending pattern do you need to do in order to get those structures to recruit in isolation?
Yeah. And
then how do you start linking them together? So we're talking glute bridge. 99% of the time people are going to show up here and go into a glute bridge and their hamstrings are going to cramp up on them. Right? So we can't even use a glute bridge. So we have to decide, what are we going to actually do to get their glutes to recruit? The piriformis, right? Think about the mechanics of the piriformis. Be like, okay, clamshells. Clamshells actually work the piriformis, not the glute medius. Right? Shocker, right? Super important, right? Because the thing is, the piriformis, it gets beat up, right? It's a weak, and really, badly abused muscle. So the thing is, we need to acknowledge the fact that we need to get some recruitment on it, and we need to work it, in a very, very gentle, yet progressive, yet active way. And then layer in things like glute medius and glute maximus.
Yeah.
So the easy answer is going to be, think about the structures that don't fire for you or for your client.
Yeah.
And what do you need to do to get an absolute sense that structure is actually recruiting? Don't worry about angles, just can I get the glutes to fire? Can I get the glute medius to fire? Can I get the piriformis to innervate?
Yeah.
Build the patterns from there.
In case it's not already obvious, this guy is a wealth of information. So if you have questions and you want to ask them, here's the time to do it. Load it on us, put it in the comments, and we'll get to your question. Basically, for me, in working with Lovedeep over the last few years, I was saying, like, it's been 3 years, 4 years? I don't even remember, but it's been a while. Through training with him, I have just learned so much more about, first and foremost, my own body and how it works, but also how to layer that information for other people into what's going on with their bodies so that we can look at things through this kind of structural lens that ends up being applicable to whatever it is that you want to do with your movement and with your life. So if we want to apply it to yoga, we can. If we want to apply it to weightlifting, we can. And it was such a game changer for me when I experienced Lovedeep's approach, which when I first came to you, I was like already doing a lot of the powerlifting stuff, and he took them all away. He saw what my lifts looked like, and he was like, yeah, we're going to just shelve that stuff for a little while, and we're going to do a bunch of this other remedial work for 3 months, 4 months at least.
It's usually about 12 weeks.
Yeah. And so that was like external rotation, rotator cuff drills, hamstring curls, Peterson step-ups, which is not sexy. It's like pretty boring for a while. But when I put that time in and I saw how I was actually like making progress and starting to lift a little bit more weight in sort of like an external rotation drill, stuff like that, and then we come back and we actually do the heavy lift again, whether it's a bench press or squat or deadlift, then that global movement feels completely different. And when I experienced that, I realized that I needed to teach in the same way. So when people were coming to me in yoga and saying like, oh, well, I really want to get wheel, I want to be able to do that back bend, or I want to do a handstand or whatever, then rather than just teaching them how to do that pose and waiting for the pose to get better, I would shelve the pose. and instead look at the pose through a lens of that deconstruction, like what are all the various little pieces and components that make it up, and how can I work on those components with my student in a way that ensures that everything then is going to be doing its job, so that when we return to the position, it's so much more accessible, it's so much more complete feeling. So that's what we do in the online course. Like that is how I break the big things down into the small components, and I show you how to sequence all together so you can still teach a class that feels like yoga but has a way more beneficial effect. Question, Maggie. How would you describe this approach in the simplest and most impactful way to the resent client? I'm talking about your old school Ashtangis.
Well, okay, you're gonna get two very different answers, because you show up with me, it's either you do it or you don't. Right, I'm very straightforward on that, right? My end goal is to make people move better and get them healthier, right? So if they've been in pain for as long as they have been, or are having resistance and challenges, right, I'm gonna be like, listen, we gotta do it this way. This is how I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna try and communicate as best you can, and make it in a way that's still, somewhat enjoyable. But my job is to get you out of pain, right?
Yeah.
So that's the way I'd probably do it myself, and that's what I tend to do. Honestly, you can only help people when they are prepared to help themselves.
Yeah, and I mean, you said something, again, Lovedeep's on Catherine's Mindful Strength podcast this week, so listen to it. And you said something in that podcast that made me think about Ashtanga people, and it might have been the tissue deformation thing. But it was something, I don't know if it was about like taking responsibility for what you're doing to yourself. I don't know. Listen to the podcast and see if you pick up on it. But with it, like having been one of those resistant Ashtangis before, I know that it something often needs to happen, like an injury, for them to actually want to investigate change. Hi, Sarah! In Ireland, Sarah. So until something happens that actually prompts them to seek out change, it's kind of like barking up the wrong tree, And I would advise directing your attention towards those who are ready, and just allowing plant the seed for those people, and then let that germinate for them, and then they'll find you when they're ready to learn. Yeah, it's totally about being patient with the process and not kind of pushing this information on stuff that in a way that is probably going to just end up turning them away from what actually is going to be better. Yeah. So with the online training, we're going to be taking different positions, like whether it's handstand or back bending or other arm balances, and even standing postures like triangle and ones that you might teach in an everyday class, and looking at what are the various different components of that position, so we can actually zero in on the stuff that your student might actually be struggling with, whether it's pelvic mobility or hip rotation or spinal centration, and give you the tools to zero in on those specific things in a way that makes the bigger stuff feel completely different and way better. I can't pin a link to the podcast right now, but if you just Google Mindful Strength and Lovedeep, you're going to find it. Okay, did we get any more questions that I haven't seen yet? We're going to sign off in a minute, guys. So if you have any final questions, send them in and we'll get to them. And, Rocky, hey, do you have suggestions for rehabilitation from a herniated lumbar disc surgery? In particular, the current symptomatic pain relief and long-term healing.
Oh, okay.
This is a big one.
It's a really big one, right? So when it comes to that, the worst thing you can do is traction, right? That's not going to be actively done by the actual patient themselves. So you don't want them on inversion tables or anything like that. You don't want them twisting and bending, right? So essentially I'm going to say yoga is probably not the best thing for them to go into, right? Unless someone actually is very, very acutely aware of what that person actually needs as far as angles. My suggestion would be find a reputable osteopath, right, and work with them. Just to understand why that disc is under herniation, because it's not just a disc in isolation.
What about Aldoa?
Aldoa can work, but only when all the prereqs are there, right? So various structures are out of whack, right? Let's just take an L4, L5, for example, right? L4, L5 rupture. I've had one of those earlier this year with a client, right? It had nothing to do with compression of the disc. Right, had everything to do with a severe deficit in his multifidus, right, relative to his thoracic spine, right? So Aldoa would not have fixed it, right? To get his legs up on the wall for L5S1, right, was just comical, right? We couldn't even get his knees bent past probably 110 degrees, right? So it was literally table work, right, and active multifidus work, which is not mentally stimulating at all, right? But it was a process. We got the disc to literally decompress in real time.
Yeah, figuring out why it happened in the first place is the big key.
So unfortunately, there's no one solid answer, right? You have to do a pretty comprehensive assessment, right?
Yeah, it's hard to just, for anyone, even when working in person, to jump ahead to potential solutions, though, first starting with, well, why did this happen to begin with?
Yeah.
Carmen, I have some left-sided anterior glide and SI pain, which causes pulling on hamstring insertion. I have stepped away from my mat after 15 years, Ashtanga, yes, and been in the weight room. Great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Keep going. What is the best advice for students with SI issues? First, let's just establish that the SI is a stable structure, and then go ahead.
So from there, it's going to come down to, like, when you're thinking about your ab training and you're thinking about your lower body training, it's got to be super progressive. You have to know your lanes. You have to know what you can and can't do, right? Don't just squat because you think squat's going to help, right? You have to understand, like I said, the idea of regressing and progressing patterns. So if you can't squat, can you do a lunge? If you can't lunge, can you do a step up? If you can't do a step up, right? Can you actually get on the floor and start doing glute bridges and recruitment patterns, right? You have to understand that your training needs to be scaled in accordance to what your capacity actually is at the time, not what exercises are, known for stabilizing.
And I found a lot of success for me in terms of the SI stuff, and just in my own body with my clients, is working on all of that, like, centration that we started with.
Absolutely,
like we do that in the first module of the online course, where it's all about showing people how to hold on to their kind of baseline position to get proximal stability. And I found that proximal stability really does an amazing job at taking away the SI stuff, like would that compensation that would be happening otherwise there?
Yeah, exactly. It's a compensation. Probably, again, the more important piece is going to be, you have to get a really thorough assessment, because the reason why it's so difficult to provide a very solid answer is because there's going to be 1,000+ answers as to why you have that issue. And it's going to be different. It can come down to whether it's vestibular, it can be visual, it can be quite literally your feet, and it can also just be orthopedic in the SI joint.
Jenny here, the supine spinal twists, how important is it to keep the shoulder on the mat? This is all dependent on what your intention is doing the twist in the first place. I think, it's just talking about, like, when we lie on the back and the knees go over to one side, keeping the shoulder on the floor. It's like, if the shoulder stays on the floor, it's going to potentially create other compensations like extension in the spine. Whereas if you just focus more on the spinal twist and allow the arm to be less of a priority keeping it on the floor, then you might actually feel something else that's less about shoulder and more about spinal rotation. Wondering when you can get back to your mat, Carmen. I know it's the kind of thing that we think that doing the yoga practice is what's keeping us flexible, but really, if you started to bring more of this, like, full range of motion loaded movement into your repertoire, such as going into, like, when you're going into the gym and doing movement that actually takes you through a full range, like a complete hamstring curl, completely extended knee, completely flexed knee, that is actually going to give you more hamstring mobility than sitting around in forward bends. Weird.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but yeah, that's sort of how it goes. Do you think yoga is over obsessed with forward bending? Yes.
Yeah.
Stretching the back fascial line? Yes. And that's the reason for a lot of yoga back pain? Yes. That's what the complete second module of our online course is about, because I find it takes so much time to get people to reconnect to that back line and get their hamstrings working again and get them just connected. Like, I remember you said, I think every yoga person that's come to train with you, 10-pound hamstring curl?
Oh yeah,
maybe,
and it's usually assisted reps at that point. And just a point based on that, really talk about the superficial back line, the various fascial lines and stuff too. Is don't get caught up in the fascia, right? When it comes to training, right? At the end of the day, we have to think about what are we doing to innervate the fascia in the nervous system, right? Muscle spindles, right? Inhibitory processes of the muscle, right? That's going to be what's going to be composing of why your fascia is aligned the way it is, right? Unless you actually want to rearrange your fascia, that's a manual therapy process. Right, or that's going to be myofascial stretching or LDOA, specialized processes, right? Contract the muscle, develop the muscle, and that will change your fascial relationship.
On that note, we're going to sign off. So thanks, guys, for tuning in and leaving us your questions. If you're watching this after the fact, you can send me a DM with any thoughts you have with this chat. Lovedeep is kind of like Pokeroo. You can't track him down and find him online. If you don't know who Pokeroo is, then you're just too young. So Lovedeep's here in Toronto. If you happen to be in Toronto, I can get you in touch with him. But I know he has like a giant wait list right now to actually work with people in person. He's going to be putting together some online offerings, so we'll do everything that we can here at Yoga Detour to put those out there to our circle when they're available. So you can access him that way, and we'll do this again sometime.
Sounds great. Sounds awesome.
Great. Yeah. Awesome. Have a great day, everyone. See you later.
Okay, thank you.